1 week. That is roughly how long passed between George Patton standing in front of the 761st Tank Battalion, telling them he had nothing but the best in his army, and Patton sitting down with his own diary to write that he had no faith in the inherent fighting ability of their race. Same battalion, same general, same handful of days in October 1944. We're going to tell you everything about the battalion caught in the middle of that contradiction today, but I have to warn you that some of what follows will complicate the version of this story you already know. Now, if you're still here, let's start with why the 761st existed at all, and then we'll get into what Patton actually said and wrote about them. This was not supposed to be a combat unit at all, at least not on the timeline the men in it were given. The 761st Tank Battalion was activated in 1942 down in Louisiana, one of the first all-black tank units the Army had ever formed, and it spent the following 2 years training at Camp Hood, Texas, far longer than most white armored units waited before deployment. The extra time had less to do with any real deficiency in the unit, and considerably more to do with senior commanders who simply did not want to be the ones who sent black soldiers into an armored fight, and were willing to keep finding reasons to delay it. The men trained on M4 Shermans and M5 Stuarts, endured segregated facilities, race-based restrictions on where they could eat and sit on base transportation, and a fairly constant undercurrent of skepticism from officers above them about whether they belonged in tanks at all. Officers cycling through the battalion's command included men who made little secret of doubting the entire premise of black soldiers operating armor in combat. And the battalion went through a string of commanders before Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates took over and stayed, becoming one of the few white officers the men trusted to actually advocate for them, rather than simply tolerate commanding them. Bates went on to fight alongside the battalion in Europe, and was himself wounded in combat commanding them, a detail veterans of the unit brought up for the rest of their lives whenever anyone suggested the 761st had been led by officers who saw the assignment as a punishment posting rather than a real command. Training exercises that would have taken white units a matter of months stretched into years, and requests to deploy the battalion were repeatedly shelved by commanders further up the chain, who kept finding new reasons the unit was not quite ready yet, even as the war in Europe consumed replacement troops faster than the Army could train them. One of the men who passed through the battalion during that training period never made it to the fighting in Europe, and the reason he did not says as much about the Army the 761st served in as anything that happened on a battlefield. Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson, years before he broke baseball's color line, was assigned to the 761st at Camp Hood, and on July 6, 1944, he boarded an Army bus and refused an order from the driver to move to the back. The Army itself had already banned segregated seating on its own buses at its own bases by that point, and Robinson knew it and said so. He was arrested anyway and referred for court-martial on charges of insubordination. The 761st's own commander, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, refused to sign off on pursuing the charges, so the post transferred Robinson to a different battalion whose commander would. His trial ran 17 days in August 1944 and ended in a full acquittal. It also ended his time with the 761st. He was kept stateside on inactive duty that October, the same month his old unit shipped out, and missed the war the men he had trained alongside were about to fight. It would be years before the world learned him as anything other than a footnote in someone else's history, long before Brooklyn and the Dodgers and a number retired across every ballpark in the country. Robinson would later say the episode taught him something about the Army he carried for the rest of his life, that the uniform did not change how the country underneath it was actually organized, and that winning an argument about the letter of the regulations did not mean the system built around those regulations had any intention of treating the win as a precedent. He never saw combat in the war at all. The battalion he trained with for 2 years went to France without him, and the record of what they did there belongs to men whose names are considerably less famous than his. If this story is landing the way it should, hit the like button right now. It helps us keep making videos like this one. The 761st finally reached the front in France in October 1944, attached to Patton's Third Army, and it was around this point that Patton addressed the battalion in person before it went into combat. Soldiers who were there that day recalled him telling them, in blunt, characteristic language, that they were the first black tankers ever to fight in the American Army, that he would never have asked for them if they were not good, that he had nothing but the best in his army, and did not care what color they were, as long as they went up there and killed the enemy soldiers in front of them. He delivered it the same way he delivered every speech to troops about to go into combat, standing on the hood of a vehicle or a low platform so the men in the back could see him, using the same profanity-laced, unmistakably personal tone he used addressing any other unit under his command, offering no obvious sign to the men listening that he held any private reservation at all about who he was talking to. He told them everyone's eyes were on them, that their own race was counting on them, and that he did not want them letting their people down, or letting him down either. It became, in the decades since, one of the most quoted things Patton ever said to any unit under his command, repeated in histories of the battalion and cited as proof that Patton judged soldiers on performance rather than skin color. His own diary from around that same week told a different story. In it, Patton wrote that the battalion had given a very good impression during its review, and then added, in the next breath, that he personally had no faith in the inherent fighting ability of the race. He wrote the encouragement the men actually heard. He wrote the doubt somewhere they would never read it. Both sentences came from the same general, describing the same soldiers, within days of each other, and only one of them was ever meant for the men themselves to hear. Patton's private views on race were, by the account of officers who served close to him, fairly consistent across the war, regardless of which unit he happened to be addressing in public that week. He was capable of publicly praising performance from soldiers he privately doubted, and the 761st was not the only group of men who experienced that particular gap between the general who spoke to them in formation and the general who wrote about them afterward in a book none of them would ever be allowed to read. What made the 761st's case unusual was not that Patton held the view. It was how completely his public words to them ended up outliving and outweighing it, quoted for decades in unit histories and museum exhibits, while the diary entry sat mostly unnoticed, until historians combing through his papers years later brought it back into the light next to the speech everyone already knew. The battalion entered combat on November 7, 1944, at the town of Morville-les-Vicq in France, and over the next 183 days fought continuously across 6 countries, one of the longest unbroken combat records of any American unit in the European theater. They fought that entire record inside a United States Army that remained officially segregated by race for the whole of the war and for nearly 4 more years after it ended, until President Truman's order desegregating the armed forces finally took effect in 1948. Every man in the 761st fought, and in many cases died, in a force structure that would not survive to include soldiers like them as equals in the same units as white soldiers, a change that arrived for the Army as a whole only after the specific war they had already finished fighting. 9 days into that record, on November 16th, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was riding in a tank approaching the town of Guebling when it struck a mine at a railroad crossing, opening a wound that cut his leg to the bone. He refused morphine. He refused evacuation. He took command of a second tank the next day and kept fighting, directing fire against German positions beyond the town, while the wound in his leg developed a dangerous infection that was, by every account from the men around him, causing him serious pain by the 3rd day. On the morning of November 19th, German guns scored 2 direct hits on his tank. Rivers was killed instantly. Still in the fight, he had refused 3 separate chances to leave. His platoon leader recommended him for the Medal of Honor within days of his death, describing exactly what Rivers had done, refusing evacuation not once but repeatedly over 3 days, while an untreated wound turned dangerous enough to threaten his life on its own, even before the German shells found his tank. That recommendation went into the same wartime paperwork system that was reviewing thousands of valor citations at once for a battalion that was, by that point in the war, already fighting far past what anyone in 1942 had expected it would ever be allowed to do. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor that followed his death took 53 years to actually reach him. It was not approved and presented until January 13, 1997, when President Clinton awarded it posthumously to Rivers' sister, Grace Wilfork, at a White House ceremony honoring 7 Black World War II veterans at once, the first and only Black Americans ever to receive the Medal of Honor for service in that war. Rivers had been dead for more than half a century by the time the country that sent him into that tank finally agreed on paper that what he had done there qualified. Tillet in particular was fought in the same brutal winter conditions that made the rest of the Bulge notorious. Snow deep enough to slow tank tracks, temperatures cold enough to freeze wounds shut before medics could reach them, and an SS Panzer division on the other side that gave no more quarter to black tank crews than it gave to any other American unit it faced. The 761st held its ground and pushed the line forward anyway, one town at a time, through a winter that was breaking other, better supplied units around it. He was not the only member of the battalion whose recognition arrived decades late. A recommendation for a presidential unit citation, the Army's own formal acknowledgement of exceptional combat performance by an entire unit, was submitted not long after the war ended in 1945. It was turned down. It stayed turned down for 33 years, until President Carter finally approved it on January 24, 1978, with the Army's own later accounting of the delay acknowledging plainly that racial discrimination and, in its own words, inadvertent neglect on the part of those in authority had played a part in keeping the award buried for 3 decades. By the time the citation finally came through, many of the men it was meant to honor were already old men, and some of them had died waiting for a piece of paper the Army had been sitting on since before most of their own children were born. Patton himself never lived to see any of that recognition arrive. He died in December 1945, a little over a year after telling the 761st he had nothing but the best in his army, and whatever he privately believed about the men he said that to went with him, recorded only in the diary entry that sat unread by the public for years afterward. The men of the battalion, for their part, mostly remembered the speech rather than the diary, because the speech was the only half of it they ever actually heard. Some of them said later that it was the first time since they had put on the uniform that a general had told them, to their faces, that he expected them to fight rather than simply expecting them to wait. That gap between what Patton said to the 761st and what he wrote about them afterward is not really a story about hypocrisy in the way that word usually gets used. It is closer to a story about an army that could ask black soldiers to bleed, for a country that had not decided, even in the moment it was asking, whether it actually believed they belonged in the fight at all. Patton needed tank crews in October 1944 more than he needed to resolve his own private doubts about the men filling them, and the speech he gave reflected that need honestly enough, even if the honesty stopped at the edge of what he was willing to write down for only himself to read later. Patton wanted results, and results were the one currency he was willing to judge anyone by in public. Whatever he actually thought about the men producing those results stayed in a book meant only for himself, at least until historians went looking for it decades later. The soldiers of the 761st carried the fighting itself more than they carried Patton's contradiction, because most of them never knew the diary entry existed until long after the war was over. They remembered Guebling and the railroad crossing where Rivers's tank hit the mine, and the 3 days he refused to let them evacuate him while the wound got worse. They remembered Tillet in the freezing cold of the Bulge, fighting SS Panzer troops in terrain that gave neither side much cover. They remembered 183 days that did not stop, across 6 countries, in tanks that had trained for 2 years longer than they should have needed to before anyone let them prove what they could do. They remembered, too, waiting for recognition that took decades to arrive. A presidential unit citation earned in 1945 and not delivered until 1978. A Medal of Honor earned in 1944 and not delivered until 1997. To a sister standing in for a brother who had been dead for 53 years by the time his country agreed he had earned it. The battle itself never took that long. The paperwork did. Some of the veterans who lived long enough to see the 1978 citation and the 1997 Medal of Honor both arrive described the feeling less as vindication than as something closer to exhaustion, relief mixed with a tiredness about how long it had taken a country to admit what they had already known about themselves since a railroad crossing outside Guebling in November 1944. They did not need Washington to tell them what they had done. They needed Washington to stop pretending it had not happened. And that took considerably longer than the war itself. Younger members of Rivers's own family who attended the 1997 ceremony spoke afterward about accepting an honor on behalf of a man none of them had ever actually met, a strange kind of inheritance, grief for a stranger who happened to share their blood and their name, arriving in a White House ceremony room more than 5 decades after the tank he refused to leave took 2 direct hits and killed him instantly. We should not forget the battalion that fought a war on 2 fronts at once, one against the German army in front of them, and one against the country's own doubts about whether they deserved to be there, doubts that outlived some of them by half a century. Did your father or grandfather serve with the 761st, or with any of the other segregated units that fought in Europe? Tell us his name in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that were never supposed to reach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Thank you for watching.